each of our profile is mapped to a set of action points, a set of actions we can take to effectively get better at decision making. But a very interesting, let's say, way to look at it in a generalized way is to take the perspective of traditional groups of people who have to make a lot of decisions. I always like to start from poker players, right? Poker players, poker in general, for me is the archetype of complex decision making under uncertainty. So I really like to look at the way that poker players usually overcome their cognitive biases so as precisely to improve the decision-making process that they do. Now, they don't really think about it too much, let's say in a detailed way. We're going to deconstruct it so that we can make it very, very explicit how they do it. But if you ask a traditional poker player, they're not going to be thinking about it in too much detail. They're just going to do it instinctively. But what essentially poker players do is they follow the decision-making process pillars that we have established in the first lecture of this course. They know that there is two outcomes that they can have. They can either win a hand or lose a hand to an opponent. They know that they have to set their priors properly. They use a concept called the range. The range is essentially the whole set of hands that their opponent can have and a weighted belief of what hand their opponent might have based on the range. It's a bit complex and technical, but stick with me here. So they set up their outcome, they set up their priors that they're going to be using throughout the hand to make the decisions. Should I check, raise, and fold or fold? This is going to be the action that is going to be available to them so that they can move forward through the hand. And then finally, they're going to get a reward from their decision to check, raise, and fold. They're either going to generate some money and take it from their opponent, or they're going to lose some money and give it to their opponent. Now, how do cognitive biases sneak in, into players' mindset? Well, this is exactly what we should get from the previous slide. I really want to highlight three of them. First of all, the sunk cost fallacy is typically something that new poker players are not very able to deal with. It's a typical emotional bias that makes you keep investing money, energy, resources in something, even though you should essentially consider that what you already have invested in that is a sunk cost. It's something that should not be part of the equation of whether you should keep investing in it. And that is essentially one of the first kind of biases that poker players need to overcome. And a traditional way that they're going to do that is through current odds computation, bankroll management, stop-loss strategies. They're going to implement all of these to be able to make the right decision in the right context. The second one is very typically the confirmation bias. They typically have an hypothesis of what their opponent holds in their hands. And instead of doing proper reasoning and looking for information signal that disproves their theory that their opponent has two aces or ace-king, they're typically going to look for evidence that confirms their belief. They put their opponent on two aces, and they're going to look at their face and say, oh yeah, he looks very confident. That's probably two aces. If you do that, you're a pretty bad poker player because you're suffering from the confirmation bias, which is an intellectual bias. And the way that, again, very intuitively poker players do overcome this bias is through verbalization, explicit weighting of evidence, and still manning their different hypotheses. Bringing up contradictory evidence to what they believe is the hand that their opponent have. And then finally, another typical bias for poker player is the status quo bias. It's usually a social bias. We can see that it's much more present in cultures, in societies that are kind of like risk averse in some sense. It's more prevalent in there. And it's definitely something that you can overcome through experimentation, computation, and prevention from forming habits. So that's really what poker players are intuitively going to do to overcome this bias. Now, we can go through the same exercise for entrepreneurs a little bit quicker. We have entrepreneurs that know what their outcome is. They want to create a venture. They want this venture to be successful, and they know that success looks like survival, and failures looks like bankruptcy of their enterprise. They have some priors in the way that they should act, in terms of the actions that they should take and things like that. These priors are usually, coming in the form of previous reading, previous discussion. Now, the actions that they can take are pretty vast. The exploration space is massive. You can hire, you can develop new products, you can set the pricing models, and then the reward that you get is essentially some growth and some value if you do things properly. Now, the biases that these entrepreneurs are very often subjected to are information overload bias, right? They think that they're making smart decisions based on data available to you, but they don't really do it because having access to too much data without being able to close the loop of where did my decision lead me? Did I generate a positive reward for that decision or not? The over-reliance on too much information without properly closing the cycle is a cognitive bias that makes you feel confident because you're making your decision based on data, but that basically is pretty similar to making decisions based on no data available. It's more or less the same thing. We have often the illusion of control that is present for entrepreneurs. They think that they can control every outcome that's happening for them. They think that they have more control in situations where things are successful and less control in situations where things are unsuccessful. And then finally, the curse of knowledge. They start to understand their product, their market so well that it becomes pretty hard for them to communicate to other people who are maybe not as familiar to the things that they are familiar with. They are struggling to communicate it properly because they're suffering from the bias of thinking that everybody has the same information, the same understanding, the same knowledge that they have because they've just spent so much time in it. And then finally, focusing on financial investors. Pretty interesting again to figure out what is their decision-making process and what are the biases that are prevalent in their minds. A financial investor knows what outcomes look like for them. They know that they can have pretty successful investments or pretty unsuccessful investments. They know that they have access to a ton of information, publicly available market information to be able to make these financial decisions. They know the actions that they can take. It's pretty constrained. It's very similar to poker players. They know that they can buy, they can sell, or they can short a stock. And then finally, they know that based on the decision that they take and on the transaction that they make in the market, they're going to observe a final reward, a final payout to whatever action they've taken. Now, what's interesting is that financial investors are very often subjected to groupthink bias. It's a social bias. It's pretty strong, especially in times of crisis, in times of societal mismanagement. And it's a bias that makes you act and think like a group when you really should be relying more on your personal experiences and personal understanding of an issue. They also suffer a lot from loss aversion bias, especially if you've gone through a streak of recent losses. You start weighting losses, let's say, disproportionately in your mental and quantified models, and you start disregarding the potential upside, the potential benefits of a decision, which leads you to suboptimal decisions for yourself or for your clients. And then finally, the choice supportive bias is a pretty important intellectual bias for financial investors as well, because it's the tendency to overstate, to overvalue the positive decisions that we've made, and to believe that our past positive decisions were, much more, let's say, in our control than the past negative decisions that we've made. It's a pretty important bias to understand as well for financial investors, and it's a bias that's quite present in the population as a whole. Understanding cognitive biases for these three profiles is precisely what helps you understand later on cognitive biases for your own profile, because it shows you the walkthrough that you have to do to question your own belief, your own assumptions, and your own biases over the long run.